And our gospel reading this morning comes from the 5th chapter of Matthew, verses 1 through 16. Please listen for the word of the Lord. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light so shine before others that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Let me know if you can't hear me, okay? First, let me say thank you for the opportunity and the privilege and the honor of being here among you throughout this day. I hope we'll have fun together. I've had fun over the last few months actually preparing for this occasion, and what you're getting is actually part of a larger project that I've been trying to work on that I hope to turn into a book in the next year or so. So thank you for the opportunity to be here with you. And especially for the hospitality that you have provided and are providing me during my visit here this weekend, especially for the nice weather. What I want us to do this morning, and actually throughout this day, is dig back into some of the old stories that are important to our identity as the people of God, maybe especially in these times of crisis facing our world. An Associated Press poll released last Monday indicates that a third, 33% actually, of Americans believe with certainty that the average temperature of the world is rising, mostly because of man-made heat-trapping greenhouse gases. This compares to 28% who think it is somewhat likely, and 37%, that's the largest number, who think it is not at all likely or not very likely. The poll also suggests that belief in climate change and its human causes declines sharply as faith in a supreme being rises. We would not be far off the mark if we or other people were to conclude from this that many American Christians do not have much room in our faith or our worldviews, either for certain forms of science, or for bad news, or maybe for the creation. Any of these would be matters of concern for us, I think, but I'm going to focus today especially on the last of those, which is the place of creation in the Christian faith and especially in the story of salvation. Why is it, I keep asking myself as I've been going to churches over the last few years to talk about the creation and what's happening around us, why is it that Christians today have such a hard time thinking meaningfully, and especially acting faithfully in ways that are engaging with the environmental issues in our midst. Why is it that churches, perhaps more than any other part of the society, are so divided often along political lines, but divided about even if we should talk about matters such as the environment or the creation? Why do so many Christians, at least 37% according to this poll of American citizens, seem to have such a low regard for the fate of the earth itself? Part of the problem, I think, is that in the last 500 years, especially in Protestant Christianity, there has been an ever-diminishing attachment to the earth in our theological perspectives. This is perhaps manifested most clearly in our own generation in the last few decades in the growing popular conviction among especially evangelical Christians that the Christian God specializes in dramatic, last-minute rescue operations, such as the rapture. But even Christians who don't think much of the rapture, I don't know if you all believe in the rapture or not, but even those who don't, like myself, may still embrace the popular notion found in all kinds of congregations that salvation is actually mostly about getting out of these bodies and off this earth and on our way into some eternal spiritual realm. From this perspective, from the idea that salvation is leaving these bodies in this world behind and moving into a spiritual realm, it's an easy step then to the conclusion that we really don't need to worry very much about what's happening to the world, since we're all just a passing through anyway. But here's the problem. As a person who reads the New Testament for a living, I'm more and more struck by how little some of these popular convictions that we seem to hold as basic truths about our own Christian faith, how little those convictions have to do with the foundational stories and beliefs that the early Christians would have known about and told one another and confessed in their society. These were stories not just about Jesus and how he saves humans, but about how he engages empires, how he engages the creation as a whole, about the kind of world that God intended us to live in, about what went wrong with that world, about how Jesus himself saves not only us, but intends to save and transform the whole of creation, and about how his followers, his disciples, might shape their sense of calling and practices as a people in light of this transformed reality. Not something we're waiting for, but something that is already happening in our midst all around us. I think we've forgotten a lot of these stories over the years, or we no longer perceive their relevance quite as clearly as previous generations of Christians may have. Or maybe we miss the connections between the story of Jesus and other parts of the story that we find in the Bible, including the creation. In any case, these stories are crucial for our sense of who we are and who God calls us to be. So that's what we're going to work on today. I need to warn you, though, I'm not much of a preacher, I'm a teacher. Okay? So what that means is I'm going to force you to do a little bit of work on text today and kind of keep up with me. I told the folks at dinner last evening that I tend to preach kind of dense sermons. Hope this one isn't too dense, but anyway, here we go. Let's start with who we are. Scientists tell us that we're actually fairly much latecomers to the life of this earth. If the earth were arranged as a series of volumes, humankind only shows up on the last page of the 10th volume of that series of stories about the history of the earth. The biologists in particular tell us that we're not particularly important in the chain of life on earth, except potentially as an agent of destruction. Do you know that there are only a couple of other species, that are directly dependent on humans for their survival? And one of those is head lice. So despite our relative late arrival on Earth and our non-essential status in the food chain, it's interesting that we have nonetheless identified ourselves, in scientific circles at least, as the goal, the pinnacle of all creation. We call ourselves Homo sapiens. That means the wise hominid, the one who comes to claim dominion over all the rest of creation. From my perspective, the jury is still out on whether Homo sapiens is a fitting designation for humankind after all, but I find it more dubious by the day. I'm more inclined actually to follow the lead that we find in Genesis, which suggests that it is not wisdom that distinguishes humankind so much as our rebelliousness, our alienation, and our insecurity in the world. So I think a more accurate designation for us might be Homo aliens, that is, the hominid who is other, the stranger on earth. And these days, Homo aliens is multiplying rapidly and wreaking havoc on other forms of life all around us. In the last 200 years, the number of people in the world has increased over sevenfold. And absent constraints, outside constraints, human population now doubles every 30 to 40 years, which is a mere geological wink. You could say that we have exploded into the world and we are now spreading like a deadly virus. But even though there are now a lot of us around, Homo aliens continues to worry about being alone and to act like a stranger in this world. We have developed ever more sophisticated means both of manipulating for our own use and sealing ourselves off from the rest of the creation. Some ecologists actually think that the term Homo gargantua would be a more honest designation for the rude, belching, flatulent creature that humans have become, whose appetite seems to have no bounds. A few biologists, in fact, have actually begun to classify humans with plague mammals, like the rats with whom we share so many genetic similarities. But while Homo aliens or Homo gargantua may be more accurate designations for what they have become, they don't really tell us anything very helpful about who we are called to be. For those answers, we need to go back to our foundational stories and gain something of a sense of our real calling, our place in this world. The passage that we have read from Matthew this morning actually suggests a number of other possibilities for how we might think about ourselves, but the one that I am most interested in is the one that we often overlook. I think even when we do pay attention to it, we probably misunderstand it, and that is the little saying in verse 13, seems kind of innocent, but here it is, "You are the salt of the earth." If you're following along in the homo pattern, that would be homo halos in the Greek, or maybe just homo sodium chloride or something like that. I couldn't find anything that had a nice ring like Homo aliens, Homo gargantua. Now, at first glance, salt of the earth seems like it should be pretty straightforward. It's paired with another saying that seems fairly clear, "You are the light of the world." We know that both salt and life are indispensable for life. So it seems like being salt of the earth should be a good thing. But what really does "you are the salt of the earth" really mean? What do you think? Anybody know what it means? Okay, it's a flavoring. We sometimes say that people are salt of the earth. What do we mean by that? Okay, yeah, salt and preservative. Yeah. Common but necessary. Okay, good. Yeah. Connected to the earth. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I grew up in a farming community in Oregon, and we had lots of people in the church I grew up in that I would have called salt of the earth type. So I always thought salt of the earth meant kind of reliable, hardworking, grounded people who are humble, lacking in pretense. I recently heard somebody say they thought salt of the earth meant somebody who makes a contribution of some sort. They hear people talk, told that they're salt of the earth in conjunction with stewardship campaigns in churches. I'd never heard that one before. Seems to me we aren't quite sure what it means. Even in our modern American idioms, we don't really know what salt of the earth necessarily means. I don't think it means here in Matthew any of those things that we have just identified, other than maybe salt as preservative or salt as seasoning for life. It doesn't seem to me at all likely that what Jesus is saying to his disciples here is, hey, you disciples are salt of the earth types. You're really good, grounded folks. making solid contributions to things. That might be true, but I just don't think that's what he's saying here. The problem is that it's not really clear to us at all what Jesus does mean by this saying. You are the salt of the earth has no direct parallels anywhere else in the New Testament. It has no antecedents that we can find in the Old Testament or any other ancient text. In fact, as far as we know, salt of the earth was not a common idiom in Jesus' day, and it might even be the case that Jesus himself is the first person in history to use this expression, which means that we should not presume that we know what he means on the basis of the way it has come to function idiomatically for us. Unfortunately, while he seems to indicate that being salt of the earth is an important thing and he wants to warn us about the dangers of losing our saltiness, he does not pause to tell us what he means by this expression. So what we have to do is we have to do a little bit of exegetical work. We have to look at the context first of all, because the context will give us a little bit of a sense of at least who he's talking to. There's an emphatic you at the beginning of both of those statements about salt and life. So you are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world. And that emphatic you connects these two sayings with what is immediately preceded, which is the final beatitude in that long string of beatitudes that we read a few moments ago. And the important thing there is that most of the beatitudes are in the third person. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the peacemakers. But when we get down to that last beatitude in verses 11 and 12, Jesus suddenly shifts into the second person, makes it emphatic, and says, blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of things, evil things about you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in the heavenly realm is great, for in that way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So if we presume that the you in you are the salt of the earth is the same you as in that last beatitude, then I think we can conclude that being the salt of the earth for Jesus has something to do with becoming prophets, even prophets who suffer rejection, persecution, maybe even death. By prophets, I think probably Jesus also has in mind something to do with all those vocations, those ways of being a Christian that he identifies in the Beatitudes that have immediately preceded. Okay, so that's a little bit of a clue. Salt of the earth has something to do with being prophetic and being like the people described in the prophets. So in what sense then would beatitude embodying and persecuted prophet disciples function as salt of the earth or light for the world? I think actually the light part is the easier part. In the Bible, it's a common symbol for salvation. Light was also used to describe Israel's calling among the nations to provide illumination and orientation for others. Jesus himself is called a light to the nations, to those who sit in darkness. So light's fairly clear. That's about manifesting something, showing people the way. Salt is much more difficult. It was a more ambiguous symbol. Salt, as some of you have already suggested, was used every day for seasoning, but mostly for a preservative among ancient people. It was, in fact, such an important commodity that it was used to pay soldiers their wages, from which we get our word salary. We also know that salt could be destructive. It was sometimes sown into fields during military campaigns in order to render the earth of those who were being conquered infertile. So it could be a negative thing. I don't think, however, that Jesus is using the salt image here in these verses in this negative kind of way. I think on the analogy of the expression of you are the light of the world, we should probably conclude that salt of the earth is salt that exists for the sake of the earth, not to harm or destroy the earth. And I think then that we would probably be closer to the intent of this saying if we were to translate this clause as not just you are the salt of the earth, but you are salt for the earth, as the light is also light for the world. Okay? But then how might Jesus' disciples, these prophetic, beatitude-following people, be salt for the earth? What does their ministry have to do with the earth itself? Well, in order to get at that, we have to do a little bit more digging in history and culture, and then some ancient texts. In addition to using salt as seasoning and as a preservative, Jewish people had a long history of using salt in association with the offerings in the temple, where it was actually considered essential in the purification process that made offerings acceptable for use. Leviticus actually requires that all offerings brought to the temple be accompanied by salt. Salt also came to function symbolically as a way of indicating the enduring quality of the covenant with God. Although Jesus talks in these sayings about salt losing its saltiness, in fact, salt doesn't lose its saltiness. If it does, it isn't salt anymore. Okay? So salt is something that seems to last forever. Chronicles reminds us that, actually tells Israel that God gave the kingship forever to David and his sons by a covenant of salt. A covenant of salt then became a symbol for one that lasts forever and ever. So I think it's possible, maybe even probable, that when Jesus uses salt here, he's drawing upon that long Jewish practice of thinking about salt as somehow connected with offerings and with the life of God's people, especially as they came before God in thanksgiving and praise, and maybe also to offer appeasement for their sins. It might even be then that what Jesus is saying is that the disciples are not only preservatives and prophets, but they're also agents of purification, maybe even living embodiments of the enduring covenants between God and Israel and between God and the earth, and therefore salt for the earth. But I think we can flesh out this idea a little bit more carefully if we dig a little bit further into some other passages in Matthew and then also in Genesis. So if you have Bibles, the next place we're going to go is Matthew 23. It turns out that the materials that Jesus is talking about here in Matthew 5 have a lot of interesting parallels and associations with what he says in his final discourse in the Gospel of Matthew, especially when he's busy denouncing in chapter 23 the Jewish leaders who are about to arrest and crucify him. In chapter 23, verses 29 to 39, Jesus again talks about the violent fate of the prophets, as he did back in chapter 5, verses 11 and 12. He says something very interesting to the scribes and Pharisees. He says, "Fill up the measure of your ancestors who murdered the prophets," this is verse 32, "so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Barachiah." Now the problem is that although we have this association between Jesus talking about prophets and the violence that prophets suffer in both of these texts, is that this passage, which talks about the blood of Zechariah and the blood of the righteous Abel, is just about as obscure for most of us today as the saying is about being salt for the earth. We're pretty much baffled by what this means. Even scholars don't know for sure which Zechariah of Barachiah Jesus is referring to here, although we have some good guesses. What we do know for certain is who Abel was. You all remember Abel? Okay. In fact, Jesus mentioning Abel here in connection with the violent fate of the prophets would have been a signal to Matthew's audience that he was drawing upon what had been actually a long, rich history, a tradition of interpretation of the story of Cain and Abel among Jewish people. Now, what we often think about the story of Cain and Abel as a kind of unpleasant afterthought to the story of creation and the account of Adam and Eve and their story. In Jewish tradition, the story of Cain and Abel actually was understood as being another crucial turning point in the larger story that involved God, humankind, and the earth, all three of those together. Because in the story of Cain and Abel, as throughout the other early chapters of Genesis, the earth is not merely the stage upon which the real drama is played out between God and humankind and the serpent. In fact, the earth is itself an active player, a character in that story who has something at stake, and as the story of Cain and Abel develops, actually takes an active role, as we'll see. So ancient Jews and Christians, it turned out, used these stories of Cain and Abel to developed their sense of what salvation meant. And they looked then for salvation as involving not only the reconciliation of humans and God, but they looked for salvation as involving the reconciliation of heaven and earth, a relationship that had become ruptured with the fall from grace. So contrary to what we usually think about the creation story, in Genesis 2, the earth is not created for humans. Rather, Adam is created for the express purpose of serving and guarding paradise. That's repeated a number of times in Genesis, and it became a primary element in Jewish tradition. But of course, after that primal sin of Adam and Eve, and after they're driven from the garden, that all begins to crumble. Adam loses his vocation as the one who is the guardian of Eden after the expulsion from Eden. But Genesis tells us that he continues in his vocation as one who is called to till or to serve the earth. And then his firstborn son after him, Cain, is also designated as one who is a tiller or a servant of the earth, at least until his murder of his brother Abel causes a still more decisive rupture in his relationship to the earth. After Cain kills Abel, God comes to Cain and tells him that Abel's blood cries out from the earth, and now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. So rather than watering and serving the earth, which was his calling, Cain has soaked the earth with his brother's blood. The first murder. It's actually probably a religious murder. And as a result, the earth no longer produces its strength for Cain, but instead cries out against him. Earth becomes, in Genesis 4, both Cain's accuser and God's agent in the realization of judgment against Cain. Cain then becomes a wanderer, estranged from both his family and from the earth that he was called to serve. And the rest of Genesis 4, which recounts the subsequent generations after Cain and Abel, indicates that Cain's offspring grow more violent with each subsequent generation as they develop human civilization around cities and implements of war, as well as agricultural tools. In the Jewish tradition that was known by both Jesus and Matthew, the earth continues to swallow the blood of the innocent and to cry out to God, because so much of humankind continues to follow in the pathway of Cain, the wanderer, no longer at home on the earth and unable or unwilling to pursue our true vocation as servants of the earth. The story of Cain and Abel is also the first articulation in the Bible of what becomes a really important principle, one again that we often overlook, that comes to expression again and again in the prophets and also in the New Testament. Namely, that the violence that we perpetrate against one another is intimately, integrally tied to the violence that we inflict upon the earth itself. Say that another way, wherever there is human violence, ecological violence is close at hand. And wherever the earth suffers damage, humans suffer injustice. What that means is that the curses associated with the fall from grace that are recorded in Genesis 1 through 4 afflict both humankind and creation alike. This might be why in Romans 8, Paul says, creation has been groaning as it awaits the revelation of the children of God. Cain and Abel, in fact, came to represent two distinct lines or generations of the descendants of Adam and Eve. Like much of the Jewish tradition before him, Matthew regards Abel as the first prophet, the father of the succession of prophets to which Jesus and his disciples joined themselves. And on the other side are those who are of the generation of Cain, upon whom all the righteous blood shed on earth now comes, including that to be shed by Jesus and his disciples. Jesus, however, does not merely continue in the generation of Cain, he actually brings it to an end. The early Christians believed that the life, the ministry, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus annuls and lifts the curses of alienation, vengeance, and death that have plagued humankind and the earth from the time of Adam and Eve. That's why Paul calls the church a part of the new creation. Early Christians believed that Jesus' ministry marked the beginning point of the reconciliation not just of humans and God, but of heaven and earth. And this, I think, has a lot to do with what it means to be salt for the earth. The disciples' prophetic vocation is to prepare both humankind and the earth for restoration. As the poor in spirit, as those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, as the merciful, as peacemakers, we identify ourselves with the members of the generation of Jesus in a world still filled with the generation of Cain. In this way, we function not only as light for the world, light that the world so desperately needs, but as the salt for the earth that seasons, purifies, and redeems both humankind and the earth itself from the ancient curse. That's our calling. That's what it means to be salt of the earth and salt for the earth. You are salt for the earth.